On the morning of January 28th, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger took off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Just 73 seconds after launch, it exploded, killing everyone aboard. I remember that day, as I'm sure many of you do, looking up at that smoke plume in the sky, and I was thinking, what went wrong? What happened? I imagine everyone was thinking that, right? But actually, there were 34 people who knew, as soon as they saw that disaster, exactly what had gone wrong and why. The Space Shuttle Challenger was interesting for a number of reasons. Most prominently, it had on board, in addition to the 6 astronauts, Krista McAuliffe, a teacher who was bringing education to space, and she brought unbelievable media attention to this launch. The launch had also been postponed over the course of the prior week, and the night of the launch was President Reagan's State of the Union address, where he was hoping to talk about the Challenger's flight. One other thing was unusual about the Challenger's flight. It was cold as heck in Florida that morning. These are pictures taken of the launch pad the morning of the Challenger flight. You can see foot-long icicles. Now, this actually sort of started the trigger of events that I'd like to share with you about this. So the day before the launch, at 2:30 in the afternoon, an engineering company called Morton Thiokol reached out to NASA and said, basically, we don't think you should launch tomorrow. It's too cold, and the O-rings might fail catastrophically. Now, the O-rings are these little rubber gaskets that connect sections of the rocket fuselage and make sure that fuel stays inside. They'd been built, as had the fuselage, by Morton Thiokol. Well, this communication started a number of phone calls back and forth, which led to a conference call that evening that lasted for 3 hours with one topic. Would the O-rings hold up in the cold temperature tomorrow or not? The engineers at Thiokol had very strong evidence that they might not. They knew that rubber would behave differently in cold temperature. It becomes stiffer. It doesn't seal as well. And they also had seen in prior cold weather launches of prior shuttles blow-by, which meant that small amounts of fuel had escaped by the O-rings, causing black carbon marks on the outside of the rocket. This is the equivalent of having, finding burned or singed newspapers next to your stove. You know you almost had a fire. You almost had a disaster on your hands. NASA wasn't convinced. One NASA manager said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? April?" At 15 minutes before midnight, the night before the launch, under pressure from NASA, Morton Thiokol faxed over a document to NASA that said, basically, we think the O-rings will be okay. You can go ahead and launch tomorrow. And they launched, and the O-rings failed, and the rocket fuel escaped, and the Challenger exploded, killing everyone aboard. Now, this isn't a talk about O-rings or space engineering. This is a talk about conversation. And when I tell this Challenger story, many people have heard about the O-rings, and very few people are aware of this conference call. And it's my contention that we've sort of mischaracterized the Challenger disaster as a mechanical failure. Sure, there was a mechanical flaw, but this was a failure of human communication. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to spend some time at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, writing and researching a book on large public sector undertakings. And one of the most remarkable and surprising findings we had was how often it was a conversation that took place before execution that made the difference between success and failure. Now, I'm a big fan of President John F. Kennedy. I was born while Kennedy was president. Like Kennedy, I'm of Irish Catholic background, and it happens that we share the same hometown of Brookline, Massachusetts. So I'd like to share with you a couple of stories from the Kennedy administration that illustrate how important conversations are. The first one started as soon as Kennedy came into office. He was informed by his military advisors that there was a planned invasion of Cuba underway. Basically, the military and the CIA had been training about 1,400 Cuban expatriates secretly in Central America with the intention of landing them on a beach in Cuba called the Bay of Pigs to try to overthrow Fidel Castro. These 1,400 amateur soldiers were folks who had fled when the Castro regime had taken power not long before. Now, Kennedy met with his military advisors, all of whom assured him of the soundness of this plan. There was one man on his staff who was deeply opposed to this plan, however, and that was this guy. His name was Arthur Schlesinger, a Harvard professor, and he knew that Fidel Castro had something like 200,000 soldiers. He knew that Fidel Castro controlled the communication on the island of Cuba, and he knew these soldiers were ill-trained and ill-equipped, but he never said anything. In his memoirs, written years later, he said, "I bitterly reproached myself for having remained silent during those critical conversations in the cabinet room." Kennedy went ahead and approved the launch, and it was a disaster. 1,400 people were either killed or taken prisoner, and it was a total PR disaster for the United States of America. Fidel Castro looked like a hero on his home island. There was only one silver lining from this fiasco, and that was this: President Kennedy changed the way he held conversations on his staff. 2 years later, this would prove remarkably important when the Cuban Missile Crisis began. The Soviet Union began building nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba that had the ability to destroy the eastern seaboard of the United States. Once again, the military advised swift military response, but Kennedy wanted conversation. He separated his staffers into two groups: one that wanted military intervention, another that was favoring negotiation and blockade. Because there were two groups, they were each able to challenge the facts and reasoning of the other. He also made sure that senior members of various groups would absent themselves from the conversations at times to ensure open and complete dialogue. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and a negotiated settlement was reached. Now, I want you to think on this. It is truly no exaggeration to say that World War III was averted because President Kennedy had learned how to create better conversation among his staff. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, I'm in business. I'm not going to launch a nuclear war. I'm not going to launch a space shuttle. But we make big decisions in business all the time, and we bring people together to do it. And it's my contention that we don't take conversations very seriously in business. But we should, because the quality of our conversations influences the quality of our decisions, and the quality of our decisions dictates the quality of our outcomes. There are reasons that human beings aren't very good at sharing everything they know in a group setting. And I call these the three myths that keep people silent at various times. The first one is the belief, the incorrect belief, that dissent equals disloyalty. That if you say something against a plan, you are undermining the authority of the leader. Nobody wants to do that. The next is similar. It's the idea that criticism of an idea is tantamount of criticism of the individual who offered the idea. Now, I would agree that you shouldn't be criticizing a colleague in public, but you've got to be able to criticize an idea, no matter whose it is. The third is to disagree with the consensus of the group is to be not a team player. This involves an individual's loyalty to the group, and it undermines our ability to speak freely and say what we truly think. So, I want to share with you a couple of techniques that you can bring in to change the context of a conversation. Because I'll tell you, simply saying, "I really want to know what you think," isn't enough. That doesn't overcome the barriers that people have. You need to change the context of the conversation. One way to do it is with what I'll call independent deliberation. You would think the best way to hear from a group would be to bring the group together and have a conversation. Counterintuitively, that's not always so. I was running a state agency at one point in time, and we would occasionally come across incidences of employee misconduct that we needed to figure out what appropriate discipline would be. And I would bring my manager together, and we would talk about what would be an appropriate consequence for this particular misdeed. It just always seemed to be the case that the group decided that whatever I thought would be a good response. So I had to change the equation. I then asked everybody in the future to come in with the information, having written out their recommendation for what would be an appropriate consequence and why. And when I did that, one of two things happened. Either there was a natural consensus that emerged, and it made me confident that we were going to be making the right decision, or people had different ideas, very different. And now we could have a conversation about why you might think a 3-day suspension is correct, and you might think that termination is the right answer in this case. That's when you have rich conversations, and that's when you're able to make a decision fully informed based on the facts. The second technique is what's called a devil's advocate or red team. And here, the leader actually assigns a group to poke holes in an idea or plan, and that becomes their job. That gives them the psychological permission to do the sorts of things that they're not allowed to do in a normal group setting around a conference table. This is done somewhat extensively in the military, where they call it a red team, and they'll be there to sort of poke holes in a plan of attack that's being offered by another group. The other place you can see it is on the cable TV show The Newsroom, when reporters are going to be broadcasting a key investigative story. The other reporters in the newsroom will hear it first and poke holes in the sources or the logic, and therefore either kill or strengthen this story before it gets aired. Because it is much better to test the strength of an idea or a story before you launch it to the public. Now, I've been talking a little bit here about ways in which conversations can be very important before large undertakings in order to draw out the pitfalls or the risks associated with these large undertakings. But there's another very important role that conversation plays as well. And that's when conversation is used to inspire and to engage and to bring people in to a great and ambitious endeavor. And again, I'm going to go with a story from John F. Kennedy. Less than 1 month after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Kennedy administration is at a low ebb. He's only been in office 5 or 6 months, and he's already been humiliated on the beaches of Cuba, and he needs to come up with something to inspire the American people. So he goes before Congress, and he starts a conversation that leads to perhaps the greatest achievement in human history. And it goes something like this. I believe that this nation should commit itself to the goal, before the decade is out, of putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No other space project at this time will be more impressive to mankind. We do not choose to go to the moon and do the other things because they are easy, but because they are hard. So, by communicating in an inspiring fashion and engaging in a dialogue with Congress and the American people, Kennedy convinced us to go on that journey. And before the decade was out, mankind was on the moon. So, as you go forth, I encourage you to go forth boldly, to dare great things, and to remember that great achievements only come after great conversations. Thank you very much.